Karen Whitmore was used to getting her way. Armed with wealth, influence, and a relentless sense of entitlement, she had turned lawsuits into her personal weapon, intimidating small businesses, demanding settlements, and ensuring that no one ever dared to inconvenience her. But this time, she picked the wrong target. It all started with a late delivery. Furious at what she saw as incompetence, Karen berated the delivery man, belittled him, and then took it a step further. She sued him. She was sure it would be another easy victory, another lesson taught, another win. But what she didn't know was that the man she had so carelessly dismissed wasn't just a delivery driver. He was James Mercer, a Harvard-educated legal prodigy, a former professor, a man who had walked away from corporate law to fight cases just like this. And unlike Karen's previous victims, he didn't settle. What followed was a brutal courtroom battle where every trick Karen had ever used was turned against her. As her past came back to haunt her, as her carefully built reputation crumbled, she realized too late. This wasn't just a lawsuit. It was a reckoning. And James Mercer wasn't here to win. He was here to end her. But how far would he go? How did a simple legal dispute spiral into total disaster? And in the end, who truly came out victorious? Stay tuned as we unravel a case of arrogance, deception, and the ultimate downfall of a woman who thought she was untouchable. And before we dive in, where are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more incredible stories, just like this one. Now let's begin. Karen versus the delivery guy, who turns out to be a Harvard law professor. The warm afternoon sun stretched its golden fingers across the pristine suburban streets of Willow Creek. It was the kind of neighborhood where perfection wasn't just expected, it was enforced. Every lawn was immaculately trimmed, every driveway was spotless, and every neighbor knew each other's business. Karen Whitmore thrived in such an environment. Her world was structured, predictable, and most importantly, under her control. That was why, when the delivery man arrived 20 minutes late, she was already fuming. From behind the grand oak door of her two-story colonial home, Karen peered through the decorative glass panels. A tall man, dressed in an unassuming navy blue polo and khaki pants, stood at her porch, holding a medium-sized package. His short, neatly combed hair and the slight stubble on his face gave him an air of effortless confidence. Karen swung open the door with an exaggerated sigh. "Do you have any idea how long I've been waiting?" she snapped, folding her arms. The man arched an eyebrow, his dark eyes calm, yet vaguely amused. "Apologies, ma'am," he said, his voice deep but polite. "There was unexpected traffic." "Traffic?" Karen scoffed, stepping forward. "I pay for premium delivery service. That means on time, not whenever you feel like showing up." The man remained composed, his posture relaxed. "I understand," he said, extending the package toward her. "If you'd like, I can note the complaint in the system." Karen snatched the box from his hands, her lips curling in disdain. "Not good enough," she said. "I want to speak to your manager." The delivery man hesitated for a moment, then smiled. "Of course," he replied, retrieving his phone from his pocket. "Would you like to file an official complaint now?" Karen's irritation flared. She wasn't used to people pushing back, especially not some courier who probably made less money in a year than she spent on luxury handbags. "You bet I would," she snapped. "And I hope you enjoy finding a new job." The man merely nodded, his fingers tapping the screen. "All right, just confirm your name, Karen Whitmore." Karen narrowed her eyes. "Obviously," she said. "And you are?" He held out his hand, as if introducing himself for the first time. "James Mercer." She ignored the gesture. "Well, James Mercer," she said mockingly. "You'll be lucky if you're still employed by tomorrow." His expression didn't change. "I guess we'll see." And with that, he turned and walked away, leaving Karen standing on her porch, her anger simmering beneath her flawless exterior. A lawsuit in motion. That evening, Karen did what she did best, took action. Sitting in her lavish home office, she typed a scathing email to the delivery company, demanding compensation for the delay and insisting that the employee, James Mercer, be terminated. But even after she hit send, a sour taste lingered in her mouth. It wasn't enough. With a smirk, She reached for her phone and called her lawyer. "Jonathan," she purred into the receiver, "how do you feel about taking on a case of gross negligence?" By the time she hung up, her decision was made. James Mercer was about to learn what happened when you crossed Karen Whitmore. The courtroom awakens. The case moved faster than anyone expected. Within weeks, it was set for a hearing at the county courthouse. The charge? Failure to provide a promised service, emotional distress, and reputational damage. Karen's legal team assured her it was a straightforward case. A formality. On the day of the hearing, Karen arrived in her signature power suit, a sleek black ensemble that radiated authority. She strutted through the courthouse doors, her high heels clicking against the marble floor, her confidence soaring. As she settled into her seat at the plaintiff's table, she allowed herself a smug glance across the room, expecting to see Mercer sweating in discomfort. But instead, he sat there, calm as ever. And worse, he was smiling. Karen frowned. What the hell is he so smug about? Her lawyer leaned in. "We've got this," Jonathan whispered. "This guy probably couldn't afford a decent attorney." Karen nodded, but something about Mercer's composed demeanor unsettled her. The judge entered. The courtroom was called to order, and Karen braced herself to see Mercer's so-called defense crumble before her. That was when it happened. The moment that shattered her illusion of control. As the opposing lawyer rose from his chair, Mercer remained seated. He simply adjusted his tie, turned to face the judge, and calmly stated, "Your Honor, I'll be representing myself." Karen blinked. The room fell silent. Jonathan shifted uncomfortably beside her. "Excuse me, what?" Judge Reynolds peered over his glasses. "Mr. Mercer, are you licensed to practice law?" Mercer smiled, adjusting his cuffs. "Yes, Your Honor. Harvard Law, class of 2012. Karen's breath hitched. The words echoed in her mind, Harvard Law. She felt the blood drain from her face. No, this wasn't possible. James Mercer wasn't just some delivery guy. He was a lawyer, and not just any lawyer. A Harvard-educated lawyer. She had spent weeks ridiculing, insulting, and suing a man who had probably spent more time studying legal theory than her entire legal team combined. Karen's fingers curled against the edge of the table. The first trickle of fear crept into her perfect world. Something told her that she had just made a catastrophic mistake. A smirk that spoke volumes. Mercer finally turned his gaze toward her, his dark eyes brimming with something Karen couldn't quite place. Was it amusement? Pity? Or worse, the anticipation? "I hope," he said, his voice as smooth as silk, "that Mrs. Whitmore is prepared for an enlightening experience in the courtroom today." Karen's stomach twisted into knots. For the first time in a very long time, she was no longer in control, and that terrified her. The weight of James Mercer's words hung in the air like an executioner's blade. Karen's mind raced, but outwardly, she forced herself to maintain composure. This couldn't be real. It had to be some elaborate bluff. Her lawyer, Jonathan, cleared his throat, leaning in. "We can still win this," he whispered, though his voice lacked conviction. "The guy's just a self-representing defendant. No matter where he went to school, we're dealing with a delivery guy." Karen nodded, clinging to that belief like a lifeline. The judge peered at Mercer over his glasses. "So, Mr. Mercer, you're choosing to represent yourself?" Mercer folded his hands on the table, nodding with practiced ease. "Yes, Your Honor. If it pleases the court, I'd like to motion for immediate dismissal on the grounds of frivolous litigation." Karen's hands clenched into fists. Frivolous? He dared call her lawsuit frivolous? Judge Reynolds raised a curious eyebrow. "That's quite the motion, Mr. Mercer. And what grounds do you present for this claim?" Mercer stood up, straightening his tie. He moved with the kind of unshaken confidence Karen loathed, the kind that suggested he was 5 steps ahead while everyone else was still lacing their shoes. "Your Honor," Mercer began smoothly, turning to face the room. "This case is based entirely on personal grievance rather than legal standing. The plaintiff claims emotional distress over a minor inconvenience. However, there is no legal obligation stating that an estimated delivery time constitutes an absolute contractual promise. Furthermore," he turned to Karen then, a glint of amusement in his eyes, The plaintiff has suffered no quantifiable damages, no financial loss, no medical trauma, and certainly no reputational harm, considering she posted about the incident herself on social media before the company even had a chance to respond. Karen's heart stopped. Her fingers twitched as she realized what he was referring to. The post. It was meant to be a simple rant, a warning to others about incompetent service providers. She had typed it in the heat of the moment, venting to her followers about how she'd single-handedly exposed the decay of modern professionalism, with receipts to prove it. Her stomach churned as Mercer continued. "I have here exhibit," Mercer said, holding up a printed screenshot. A public statement from Mrs. Whitmore before she even filed the lawsuit, where she herself acknowledges that the issue had already been reported and that she, quote, "had to take justice in her own hands by suing me personally." Karen's mouth went dry. Jonathan flipped through his papers frantically. "Your Honor, we object. This post isn't legally relevant." The judge waved a hand. "I'll decide that." "Continue, Mr. Mercer." Mercer stepped forward, calm as ever. "Beyond the plaintiff's lack of damages, we must also examine her target." He turned slightly toward Karen then, his voice taking on a different tone, one that wasn't just legal but personal. "Mrs. Whitmore assumed I was merely a delivery worker. She made that assumption because of my appearance, my clothing, and my role in that single moment of interaction. She didn't ask about my background. She didn't investigate whether I was an employee or a third-party contractor. She simply assumed, and from that assumption, she decided I was beneath her, beneath scrutiny, beneath courtesy." Karen's pulse pounded against her temples. The jury was watching now, their faces unreadable, but their eyes trained on her. Mercer continued, "Had Mrs. Whitmore done a single moment of research, she would have found out that I am not an employee of the delivery company, but rather an independent business consultant volunteering in a logistics efficiency study. In fact," he held up another document, sliding it across the table toward Jonathan, "I was actually hired to evaluate customer interactions and assess complaint for training purposes, meaning that the only reason I was on that shift in the first place was to study people like her." The room fell silent. Karen's mind blanked. No, this isn't happening. She could feel her carefully built foundation cracking beneath her. Jonathan grabbed the document, scanning it, his face twisting. He turned to Karen, barely masking his panic. "This is real," he muttered under his breath. "Karen, this is—" "I don't care what it is," she hissed back, voice low. "Find a way around it." But Mercer wasn't done yet. "If my motion for dismissal is denied," he said, turning back to the judge, "I will countersue for defamation, lost wages, and reputational harm due to the plaintiff's deliberate misrepresentation of the facts." Karen's ears rang. "He's suing me back?" "Furthermore," Mercer added, pacing slightly, "since the plaintiff is pursuing emotional distress claims, I'd like to introduce an additional point." Jonathan stood. "Objection. What additional point?" Judge Reynolds motioned for Mercer to explain. Mercer turned to Karen once more, and this time, his smile was razor-sharp. Her own history of lawsuits. The air left Karen's lungs. She gripped the edge of the table, feeling the first tremors of real fear. "What?" she managed to whisper. Mercer lifted a neatly organized folder. "Public records indicate that Mrs. Whitmore has filed 6 prior lawsuits against small businesses in the past 5 years. Notably, all of them were for service dissatisfaction, and all of them resulted in out-of-court settlements. These businesses either lack the financial means to fight or simply wish to avoid the bad publicity." He paused. "But I am neither financially struggling nor afraid of court." A ripple of murmurs spread across the room. Jonathan turned to Karen, his voice a whisper of barely restrained fury. "You never told me you do this all the time." Karen's throat closed. She had assumed those cases wouldn't matter. She hadn't thought anyone would dig that deep. But Mercer had. And now, everyone in the courtroom was looking at her differently. Karen felt her grip on the situation slipping further and further out of reach. Judge Reynolds finally spoke, his voice carrying a weight that silenced the murmurs. "We will take a recess before I rule on the motion for dismissal." He banged his gavel, and the room stirred as people rose from their seats. Karen didn't move. She sat frozen, staring straight ahead, her perfectly curated world crumbling around her. James Mercer, the delivery guy, had just turned her own weapons against her. And for the first time in her life, Karen realized she might not win. The courtroom emptied slowly, but Karen remained seated, her mind spinning like an overworked machine. Her heartbeat pounded against her ribs, the reality of the situation pressing in on her like a collapsing ceiling. She had walked into this trial convinced it would be an easy victory. Another notch on her belt, another lesson to teach an incompetent worker. Instead, she found herself teetering on the edge of a legal disaster, her reputation under siege by a man she had underestimated. James Mercer. She glared at him from across the room, where he stood talking casually with a few bystanders. He looked unbothered, like a man who had already won before the real battle had even begun. Jonathan sat beside her, gripping his forehead with both hands. "Karen," he muttered, barely keeping his voice level, "I don't know how to spin this." She turned sharply toward him. "You're my lawyer. Figure it out." Jonathan exhaled through his nose, trying to regain composure. "He's got you cornered. He's already destroyed half our argument, and we haven't even reached full testimony yet." He glanced around, then leaned in, lowering his voice. "And you never told me about the other lawsuits." Karen's jaw tightened. They were settled. They weren't supposed to matter. Jonathan scoffed. "They always matter. The second you have a history of similar cases, it changes how the court sees you. It makes you look." Karen shot him a warning glare. Jonathan sighed, like someone who does this for sport. Karen clenched her fists under the table. "It's not a sport," she hissed. "I only sue when people don't do their jobs right. I keep people accountable." Jonathan gave her a look that bordered on disbelief. "That's not how it looks, Karen. To them, to the judge, it looks like you go around bullying small businesses into settlements." Karen opened her mouth to protest, but she stopped herself, because, for the first time, she realized that was exactly what she had been doing. On the other side of the room, Mercer casually placed his hands in his pockets, exchanging a few words with the court clerk before stepping toward the exit. His movements were measured, deliberate, as if he were in complete control of everything that happened next. Jonathan noticed and muttered, "Look at him. He's already planning his next move." Karen's lips pressed into a thin line. That man, who she had once dismissed as a simple delivery worker, had not only evaded her lawsuit, but had managed to turn it back on her. She wasn't just fighting to win anymore. She was fighting to survive. Before she could dwell on it further, Mercer turned and met her gaze. He gave her a small, knowing smile. Karen's stomach twisted, and then he walked out of the courtroom. Jonathan pulled Karen aside into a quiet hallway. The courthouse was buzzing with murmurs, people whispering about what had just unfolded. "We need a new angle," Jonathan said. "We need something to discredit him." Karen's mind raced. Mercer was clean, too clean. He had anticipated everything. If they wanted to win, they had to shake him. "Find something," she ordered. "I don't care how deep you have to dig, but I want something that makes him look worse than me." Jonathan hesitated. "Karen, do it." He nodded grimly and stepped away to make a few calls. Karen exhaled, trying to push down the rising panic. She wouldn't lose. She couldn't lose. And if she had to play dirty, then so be it. As she turned to leave, a voice stopped her. "Mrs. Whitmore." She turned abruptly. Standing before her was a woman in her late 40s, elegantly dressed in a tailored gray skirt suit. Her expression was unreadable, composed yet sharp. Karen narrowed her eyes. "Who are you?" The woman extended a hand. "Eleanor Hayes, senior partner at Lancaster & Associates." Karen stiffened. She knew that name. Lancaster & Associates was one of the most elite law firms in the country. And suddenly, Karen felt a sliver of hope. "I assume you're here about the case?" Karen asked, forcing confidence back into her voice. Eleanor nodded. "Not in the way you might think." Karen frowned. "Meaning?" Eleanor tilted her head slightly. "I'm here for Mr. Mercer." Karen's stomach dropped. "What?" Eleanor glanced around, then motioned for Karen to follow her into a more secluded corridor. When they stopped, she lowered her voice. "I'm sure you've realized by now that Mr. Mercer is no ordinary opponent," Eleanor said. Karen crossed her arms. Yes, I gathered that when he obliterated my case in under 15 minutes. Eleanor's lips twitched slightly, but she didn't smile. Mercer isn't just a lawyer. He's a closer. Karen narrowed her eyes. What do you mean? Eleanor studied her for a moment before continuing. James Mercer doesn't lose cases. He's been involved in some of the most high-profile legal battles in the country. Every lawsuit he takes, he dismantles. Completely. Karen's throat tightened. That's impossible. Eleanor shook her head. It's not. Karen wanted to argue, wanted to insist that she still had a chance. But a nagging voice in the back of her head whispered otherwise. He's a specialist in legal reversals, Eleanor continued. Meaning, he doesn't just win, he flips cases. He turns plaintiffs into defendants. He exposes weaknesses that even veteran lawyers don't see coming. Karen's blood ran cold. She had walked into this lawsuit thinking she had the upper hand. But she had hand-delivered Mercer exactly what he needed to destroy her. Eleanor exhaled, her gaze unreadable. I came to warn you because I know how this ends. And trust me, you don't want to find out firsthand. Karen swallowed hard. For the first time in her life, she had no response. No comeback. No plan. Just fear. Pure, unfiltered fear. She had picked the wrong opponent. And now, she had to face the consequences. Karen stood frozen, her mind whirling as Eleanor Hayes's words echoed in her ears. James Mercer doesn't just win. He flips cases. You don't want to find out firsthand. For the first time in her life, Karen felt what it was like to be on the wrong side of power. She wasn't the one in control. She wasn't the one calling the shots. And worst of all, she wasn't sure how to fix it. She squared her shoulders, trying to mask the gnawing panic clawing at her chest. Why are you telling me this? She asked, keeping her voice firm. Eleanor tilted her head slightly. Consider it professional courtesy. Karen scoffed. Courtesy? You work for him, don't you? Eleanor smirked. No, but I've gone up against him before. And I lost. That hit harder than Karen wanted to admit. Eleanor adjusted the cuffs of her blazer. I know you think you can fight this, but if you take my advice, you'll settle before he destroys you. Karen gritted her teeth. I don't settle. Eleanor sighed, almost like she pitied her. Then you better prepare for what's coming. And with that, she turned and walked away, leaving Karen standing alone in the dimly lit corridor, her heart pounding so hard it felt like it would crack her ribs. Back in the courtroom, Jonathan returned, looking paler than before. I couldn't find anything on him, he admitted in a hushed voice. Karen's jaw clenched. You're telling me this guy has no dirt? No financial scandals? No past cases where he got in trouble? Nothing? Jonathan shook his head. No. In fact, he hesitated, rubbing his temple. Karen narrowed her eyes. What? Jonathan sighed. I found out that he used to be a professor at Harvard Law. He left to work for a high-profile legal firm, but get this, he quit that job to do independent consulting. The firm didn't fire him. He walked away. Karen's stomach twisted. Why would he do that? Jonathan shrugged. No clue. But one thing is clear, he's not in this for money. He's in it because he enjoys taking people down. Karen swallowed hard. She knew that type of person. Because she was that type of person. The recess ended, and everyone returned to their seats. The judge took his place, looking over the court with mild impatience. Before we continue, Judge Reynolds said, I have ruled on the motion for dismissal. Given the evidence presented, the court finds reasonable grounds to proceed with Mr. Mercer's counterclaim. Karen's heart stopped. Counterclaim. Jonathan cursed under his breath. Damn it, he's turning this on us. Karen's throat tightened. This isn't happening. But it was happening. And James Mercer was just getting started. Mercer stood up, his face unreadable. Thank you, Your Honor. In that case, I'd like to proceed with my opening statement regarding the damages I've suffered due to this lawsuit. The way he said it, so casual, so effortless, sent a fresh wave of rage through Karen's veins. He was treating this like a game. Karen dug her nails into the table. Fine. If he wanted to fight, he'd get one. But then Mercer spoke again, and her world tilted even further off balance. Before we proceed with testimony, he said smoothly, I'd like to call my first witness. Karen frowned. Witness? Judge Reynolds raised a brow. Proceed. Mercer turned toward the doors. I'd like to call Thomas Whitmore to the stand. Karen's blood went cold. Jonathan's head snapped toward her. Who the hell is Thomas Whitmore? Karen didn't answer, because she already knew. The doors swung open, and in walked a man she hadn't seen in over 15 years. Her ex-husband. Thomas Whitmore looked older, his once jet-black hair streaked with silver. He still had that same self-assured walk, the same piercing gaze that had once made her fall in love with him before she had burned their marriage to the ground. Karen's stomach twisted into knots. Why is he here? She shot a glare at Mercer. What the hell are you playing at? Thomas took the stand, raising his hand to swear the oath. Once seated, Mercer approached him with his usual ease. Mr. Whitmore, Mercer began, can you please state your relationship to the plaintiff? Thomas cleared his throat. I was married to Karen for 8 years. A ripple of murmurs spread through the courtroom. Karen's nails dug into her palm. She could already see where this was going. Mercer nodded. And during your marriage, did Mrs. Whitmore ever engage in any legal disputes similar to this one? Karen stiffened. Objection. This has nothing to do with the case. Judge Reynolds held up a hand. Overruled. I'll allow it. Karen felt the floor beneath her shift. Thomas exhaled, his face unreadable. Yes, he admitted. Karen had a tendency to threaten lawsuits when she didn't get her way. A sharp pain lanced through Karen's chest. The betrayal stung, but she refused to let it show. Mercer folded his hands behind his back. Can you elaborate? Thomas hesitated, then sighed. She once sued a boutique for refusing to refund a dress she had worn. She threatened to sue our old country club when they raised their membership fees. And he trailed off, his eyes flickering toward her. Karen glared at him. Don't you dare. But Thomas turned back to Mercer. And she threatened to sue me when I filed for divorce. The courtroom erupted in gasps. Karen felt her pulse hammering in her skull. He wouldn't, but he just had. Mercer nodded, completely unaffected by the uproar. And was that lawsuit legitimate? Thomas shook his head. No, it was just to scare me into backing down. Karen felt like she'd been punched in the gut. Mercer turned to the judge. Your Honor, I present this as evidence that Mrs. Whitmore has a documented pattern of using the legal system as a weapon. Judge Reynolds stroked his chin, clearly considering it. Karen clenched her fists. This is ridiculous. The judge held up a hand. Mrs. Whitmore, you'll have your chance to respond. Karen bit the inside of her cheek so hard she tasted blood. She turned to Mercer, her voice venomous. You planned this. Mercer met her gaze, his expression unreadable. Of course I did. And in that moment, Karen understood something she hadn't before. Mercer wasn't just here to win. He was here to break her. And worse, he was succeeding. Karen's hands curled into fists under the table, her nails digging in her palms so hard she nearly broke the skin. She had walked into this courtroom expecting an easy victory, a mere formality. Now, she was trapped in a public execution, and James Mercer was the executioner. Across the room, her ex-husband, Thomas Whitmore, sat with an air of quiet composure. He wasn't gloating, wasn't smirking. That almost made it worse. He wasn't here out of revenge. He was here because he genuinely believed he was doing the right thing. That was unacceptable. Karen turned sharply to her lawyer, Jonathan, her voice a harsh whisper. Why the hell didn't you anticipate this? Jonathan wiped his forehead, his frustration barely concealed. Because I don't have a time machine to go back and stop you from making terrible decisions? Karen sucked in a breath. She didn't have time for this. Judge Reynolds tapped his gavel. Mrs. Whitmore, do you have any questions for Mr. Whitmore? She forced herself to her feet. Every eye in the room was on her, and for the first time, she hated it. She was always the one people looked up to, admired, feared. Now, she felt like a spectacle, a woman who had finally met someone she couldn't control. She approached the witness stand, keeping her steps measured. Mr. Whitmore, she said, her voice smooth but edged with steel. You say, I have a pattern of using the legal system as a weapon. Thomas met her gaze, his expression unreadable. Yes. She tilted her head. And yet, when we divorced, you walked away with half of everything. including assets I earned before we were even married. Strange, isn't it? How the courts always seem to favor you. A murmur rippled through the gallery. Karen pressed on before Thomas could answer. Isn't it true that you benefited from the same legal system you're now claiming I abused? Thomas hesitated. I'll take that as a yes, Karen cut in smoothly. No further questions. She turned on her heel and strode back to her seat. It wasn't a victory, not by a long shot, but it was something. She glanced at Mercer. He was watching her, head slightly tilted, as if studying her. Karen met his gaze. You might have caught me off guard, but I don't go down without a fight. Mercer smiled. After Thomas was dismissed, Judge Reynolds called for another recess. Karen barely made it out of the courtroom before she felt someone at her side. James Mercer. She spun toward him, her voice low and sharp. Enjoying yourself? He gave a small chuckle. Immensely. Karen gritted her teeth. You think you're clever, but you're making a mistake. Mercer raised an eyebrow. Oh. She stepped closer, her voice a near whisper. I have resources. People in high places. Do you really think a no-name consultant is going to come out of this unscathed? Mercer's smile didn't waver. Karen, I was arguing case law before you even knew how to spell litigation. She inhaled sharply, but he continued. And let's be honest, Mercer mused. You don't actually care about winning anymore, do you? Karen stiffened. You just don't want to lose. Her jaw locked. Mercer glanced at his watch, then back at her. I'll give you an out. She frowned. What? You drop the case, Mercer said smoothly. You issue a public statement admitting you made a mistake, and I won't pursue damages for defamation. Karen let out a sharp, humorless laugh. You must be joking. Mercer shrugged. Your call. Karen narrowed her eyes. And if I don't? Mercer smiled. Then I keep going. She searched his face for hesitation. There was none. Karen turned and walked away before she could say something she'd regret. Because for the first time, she realized. He isn't bluffing. Back in the courtroom, Karen's mind raced. She needed leverage. Something. Anything. She turned to Jonathan. We're playing defense now. I want you to discredit Mercer. Jonathan exhaled through his nose. I already told you. He's clean. Karen's fingers tapped against the table. No one is that clean. Jonathan hesitated. There's one thing. She turned sharply. What? Jonathan leaned in. He left Harvard. Not just the school, his position as a professor. And then he left his firm. Karen's heartbeat picked up. So, no one walks away from a career like that unless something happened. She grinned. Find out what it was. Jonathan nodded and hurried out of the courtroom, phone already in hand. Karen sat back, crossing her legs. Your move, Mercer. 30 minutes later, court resumed. Mercer stood. Your Honor, I'd like to call my next witness. Karen braced herself. Mercer turned toward the door. I'd like to call. He paused, almost for dramatic effect. William Grayson. Karen's breath hitched. The doors opened. An elderly man stepped inside, his posture stiff, his expression grim. Karen's stomach dropped. William Grayson was one of the most respected judges in the state. He had presided over some of the biggest cases in legal history. And more importantly, he was her father's oldest friend. She turned to Jonathan in horror. Why is he here? Jonathan was just as stunned. I don't know. Mercer let the silence stretch before speaking. Judge Grayson, thank you for being here. The older man nodded. I'm not doing this for you, Mercer. Karen's skin prickled. Mercer's expression didn't change. Of course. Let's get right to it. How long have you known Mrs. Whitmore? Grayson exhaled. Since she was a child. A murmur rippled through the court. Karen's nails dug into the table. Mercer clasped his hands behind his back. And in your professional opinion, does she have a history of using the legal system for personal gain? Karen stood so fast her chair scraped loudly against the floor. Objection. The judge barely looked at her. Overruled. Karen sucked in a breath, her heart hammering. Grayson hesitated, then spoke. Yes. Karen felt the world tilt beneath her. Her father's closest friend had just condemned her. Mercer turned to face her fully. No further questions. Karen's vision blurred as she sat back down. Mercer had just played his final card, and she had nothing left. Karen felt the walls closing in. The air in the courtroom grew thick, suffocating, pressing against her ribs. Judge William Grayson, her father's oldest friend, a man she had known since childhood, had just publicly confirmed what Mercer had been carefully constructing all along. Karen Whitmore abused the legal system. And now, the entire courtroom knew it. She could hear the murmurs, see the subtle smirks from a few of the reporters scribbling notes on their pads. Her reputation, her carefully built legacy, was unraveling faster than she could stop it. She gritted her teeth. No, I refuse to let this be the end. She turned to Jonathan, her voice a sharp whisper. Tell me you found something on Mercer. Jonathan hesitated. His silence was the answer she didn't want to hear. Her eyes darkened. Are you kidding me? Jonathan exhaled. Karen, I dug everywhere. There's no scandal, no personal dirt. The only thing I found is that he left Harvard and his law firm voluntarily. No disciplinary actions, no lawsuits. Nothing. Karen clenched her fists. There has to be a reason. No one walks away from careers like that unless they're hiding something. Jonathan looked pained. That's just it. He's not hiding. He's clean. Karen's pulse pounded in her ears. She had spent her entire life controlling people, outmaneuvering them. But Mercer? He was playing a different game altogether. And she was losing. Karen barely registered the moment Judge Grayson stepped down from the stand. Mercer's expression remained unreadable, but she could feel the quiet satisfaction in the way he adjusted his cuffs. This wasn't just about winning for him. This was about breaking her. Judge Reynolds turned to Jonathan. Would the plaintiff like to call any witnesses? Jonathan hesitated. Karen saw the doubt flicker across his face. He didn't think they could win. Traitor. She forced herself to stand. We'd like to recall James Mercer to the stand. A few surprised murmurs rippled through the courtroom, but Mercer simply smiled. Of course, he said smoothly, rising from his chair. He walked to the witness stand with the kind of confidence Karen despised, the kind that came from knowing you were untouchable. He swore his oath, sat down, and folded his hands neatly in his lap. Karen stepped forward, her heels clicking against the polished courtroom floor. She had one last chance to regain control, one last chance to destroy him. She clasped her hands behind her back, tilting her head slightly. Mr. Mercer, you've gone to great lengths to discredit me. But what about your history? Mercer raised an eyebrow. My history? Yes. She started pacing slowly, deliberately. You graduated from Harvard Law, became a professor, worked at one of the most prestigious law firms in the country. And yet, she turned sharply. You walked away. The courtroom held its breath. Karen smiled. Why? Mercer's gaze didn't waver. Because I wanted to. She let out a short laugh. Oh, come on. That's the best answer you've got? You voluntarily abandoned one of the highest-paying legal careers in the country for fun. Mercer exhaled, resting his chin on his hand. Not for fun, he said, his voice calm. For principle. Karen frowned. Principle? Mercer leaned forward slightly. I left because I got tired of people like you. A murmur spread through the gallery. Karen's stomach twisted. Excuse me? Mercer's voice remained smooth, controlled. I got tired of watching the wealthy and the powerful weaponize the legal system to silence people, manipulate outcomes, and bully those who couldn't afford to fight back. Karen's nails dug into her palm. This case isn't just about you suing me, Mercer continued. It's about the countless times you've used your privilege and resources to punish people for things that were never illegal. It's about the boutiques you sued for not refunding dresses you'd already worn, the businesses you threatened when they didn't give you special treatment, the country club you tried to sue because they changed their own policies. Karen's face burned. And more importantly, Mercer said, locking eyes with her, it's about the people who had no choice but to settle because they couldn't afford to fight. A heavy silence fell over the room. Karen's throat tightened. She refused to let him take control of this narrative. So what? She shot back. You're some kind of legal vigilante? Mercer tilted his head. Call it what you want. But I made a choice. I walk away from power because I wanted to help people beat people like you. Karen's breath caught, and suddenly she saw it. James Mercer wasn't just here to win this case. He was here to end her. Her lawsuits. Her reputation. her ability to ever pull something like this again. She had picked the wrong target, and now she was paying the price. The air in the courthouse felt heavier than ever. Karen sat at the plaintiff's table, back stiff, fingers curled tightly against the smooth wood. She barely heard the whispers around her, barely noticed the way people sneaked glances in her direction. She could feel the walls closing in. James Mercer sat across from her, calm as ever. He wasn't smirking, wasn't gloating, just watching, waiting. That somehow made it worse. She turned to Jonathan, her voice a sharp whisper. "Tell me we have a shot." Jonathan exhaled, looking defeated. "Karen." "No," she snapped. "Tell me we have a shot." Jonathan hesitated. "The best thing we can do now is negotiate minimizing the damages." Karen's stomach twisted. No, that wasn't good enough. She wasn't supposed to be negotiating. She was supposed to be winning. The judge entered, and the courtroom rose in unison. Karen forced herself to stand, her head held high, even as her insides churned with unease. This was it. The verdict. Judge Reynolds settled in his seat and glanced at both parties before clearing his throat. "I have carefully reviewed the evidence presented in this case," he began, "and I must say, it has been enlightening." Karen's pulse hammered against her ribs. The judge sighed. "It is clear that the plaintiff, Mrs. Whitmore, has pursued this lawsuit with little legal standing. Not only has she failed to demonstrate damages, but evidence suggests that her history of litigation follows a pattern of personal grievances rather than legitimate claims." A fresh murmur spread through the courtroom. Karen's nails dug into her palm. This court cannot, in good conscience, allow the legal system to be weaponized in such a way. Karen's breath hitched. In the matter of Whitmore versus Mercer, the case is dismissed with prejudice. The words slammed into Karen like a freight train. Dismissed. With prejudice. That meant she couldn't refile. That meant it was over. But the judge wasn't finished. "Furthermore," he continued, "given the compelling evidence provided by the defendant, this court finds reasonable grounds to move forward with Mr. Mercer's counterclaim." Karen's entire body went cold. She barely processed the words. Mercer's lawsuit was moving forward. She was no longer the plaintiff. She was the defendant. Karen forced herself to breathe, forced herself to think. She turned to Jonathan, heart pounding. "Fix this." Jonathan shook his head. "Karen, I can't. Fix it." But he didn't respond, because there was nothing to fix. She had lost, and not just the lawsuit. Her reputation was in ruins. People would talk. The reporters would write about this. Her name would be dragged through the mud. And James Mercer? James Mercer had won. She turned to him, desperate for any sign of weakness, any sign that he might be open to negotiation. But he just smiled. Not a smirk, not arrogance, just finality. "Mrs. Whitmore," Mercer said smoothly, "it appears the tables have turned." Karen's mouth was dry. She had walked into this battle thinking she was untouchable. She had walked in believing she would crush him. But in the end, she was just another name in his win column. Judge Reynolds banged the gavel. Court adjourned. The world around Karen blurred. It was over. And for the first time in her life, Karen Whitmore had lost. 2 months later, the fallout had settled. Karen had been forced to issue a public apology, admitting her claims against Mercer were unfounded. She had avoided financial ruin, barely, but the damage to her reputation had been done. Her name was tainted. The lawsuits she had once filed with ease, they were no longer settling, because now every defendant had a new strategy. If Karen Whitmore sues, fight back. The power she once held had been broken. And James Mercer? James Mercer had disappeared. No interviews, no statements. He had simply walked away, as if this had been just another routine day in his life. But Karen knew better. She knew exactly what had happened. James Mercer hadn't just beaten her. He had made sure she could never do this again. And for that, she hated him. But deep down, beneath all the rage and bitterness, a small part of her feared him, because James Mercer had been unstoppable, and Karen had been nothing more than a lesson in his long line of victories. The lesson? Never underestimate the wrong opponent.